There are many things that we collectively, as a society and civilization, have decided to just jump into in modernity, despite not really examining the consequences. We create technology and we just run with it, and we hope it works out. We don't typically think about the long term consequences of the things we invent and the technology we use. We just try to somehow navigate it as best as possible. But this is also true for other decisions that we make. For example, the notion of men and women working closely together in a relatively tight knit environment. Now, this was not something that really ever happened in former times. There have been, in historic and prehistoric times, tremendous differences between the way men and women operated and interacted with each other compared to modern times. Now, it should be fairly obvious why there might be, say, a government incentive for wanting women to work as much as men, theoretically, and that is tax revenue. More taxpayers in the eyes of a government, that's always a good thing, of course. But one thing that's just fundamentally different from former times is the exact setting in which men and women work together. In previous times, men and women had different roles of labor, and they would not work typically side by side. And to the extent there was interaction, they were almost always mates, i.e. spouses of each other, or family or extended family members. It was not this radically different environment we currently find ourselves in, namely complete strangers of the female sex and complete strangers of the male sex working in close-knit environments, such as an office. And this is one thing I have to say I agree on when it comes to Jordan Peterson. He has said and stated to the effect of, we've never tried it before. We don't know what it's like for men and women to work together. Not in this capacity. Yes, in some way men and women have worked together in the past, but not in the way I've just described it. Unrelated males and females working in a close-knit environment for upwards of 40 hours a week, right? That is highly unusual. It's ahistorical, and I'm not making an argument from history here, but it's ahistorical, and we just don't know the consequences yet. Or do we? We actually do know some of the consequences. All the friction and the tension, the things that are complained about to HR departments, the issues of sexual harassment, which I'm sure actually do take place. These are all consequences of having mixed sex work environments of unrelated males and females that are not married to each other. It's one thing if you're working with your mother or your sister, your grandmother, even your female cousin or your wife. It's a very different thing when half the office is female and you have no relationship with them other than your work, and you are perhaps average looking or low status. And of course, this fits into the equation too, because it's not just a matter of working with women together in an office, although that's the beginning of it, that's the beginning of the issue. It's the fact that depending on where you rank in terms of your SMV, as many people have discussed, you will be perceived differently. If you're an average Joe, then there'll probably be some latent hostility. And if you're nice to people, specifically women, it will be perceived as threatening, perhaps. If you look like Brad Pitt or a Chad, it's probably going to receive positively. It will not be reported to HR. And if you're a sub 5, it might be GG, and you might consider leaving the environment entirely, because no one's going to be kind to you, least of all the women. Now, part of the evidence for why this doesn't work particularly well is after the initial wave of work that incorporated both men and women in the same environment, you would get situations fairly routinely of men and women in the same work environment partnering up, dating, and eventually marrying each other. It wasn't entirely unheard of. The rates were somewhere around 30%, depending on the time and place, but it wasn't frowned upon. It wasn't seen as this awful, evil thing to engage in some kind of romantic relationship with somebody at work if they happen to be female. These days, the attitude in general, assuming you're average looking or worse, is something more along the lines of don't eat where you crap, so to speak. Work is now an environment where you take your dumps, and therefore you shouldn't eat there. Unless, of course, you're possibly Chad, in which case it's probably okay. And this is yet another topic that we don't have an open public discussion about because it's just assumed to be a given and a good thing. Now, of course, in terms of tax revenue, in terms of generating income, and to a large degree for women, because women now have their own money and women dictate the terms of labor because, as we know, HR departments are dominated by women, and because of the politics of the time, they have the say of how things are supposed to be. Of course, it's good for them in some respect. But let's be honest, by and large, men have received the short end of the straw here. If you're an average-looking guy and you work in an office with a lot of women, there's a high probability that you could get into trouble if you're too forward, too honest, too nice, too whatever. So the best policy in such cases is to keep it on the DL and keep to yourself. Now, years ago, I used to work in an office, and on top of that, I used to work as a teacher. And teaching, of course, is a profession that is often dominated by females, although in my case, it was more like 50-50. And even in a teaching environment, we're not sharing an office, but sort of sharing time on break or whatever, you could notice the tension, the issues. And in an office environment, if they don't like you, they will get you into serious trouble. I'll never forget this time, and it's a story I've told before on the channel, but it's worth repeating, that I made food at home and would take it in for quote-unquote lunch, the midday meal, at this particular office I was working at. And I had some minuscule amount of red onions in this salad that I made. And out of the blue, these two females that would always gang up on me and didn't like me for whatever reason, maybe because they didn't like the way I looked or my attitude, who knows, complained that the red onions smelled bad. And I thought that was it. But apparently afterwards, they complained to the boss. It was a small company, only a couple of people working in the office. And he told me that I couldn't bring in food anymore that had red onions in it. Now, obviously, he didn't tell me that these two females told him that they were complaining and blah, 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 but it's kind of obvious. They complained once to me, and then a day or two later, oh, I can't do this anymore. So, yeah, 1 + 1 = 2, right? So it's pretty logical as to what happened. And this was a small incident. It wasn't something major. I generally tried my best not to engage with them. They clearly didn't like me from the get-go. And I also noticed this during my teaching career. The women at least nominally got along well with each other, but I oftentimes was the odd male out, and I usually kept to myself, and I didn't try to mingle too much, because even back then I knew it could be interpreted in the wrong way, and most of them, of course, wouldn't be interested in me, because I'm just an average-looking guy, whatever. So I ended up just observing a lot. It is very difficult to work with women. And apparently, or not so apparently, it's not just men who think that. Indeed, I have talked to multiple females during the course of my almost pushing 50 years who've indicated to me that they don't like working in an office or work environment that is dominated by females. Too much gossip, too much of the usual shenanigans that you might readily associate with females. I've had females tell me this straight up, while in the same breath saying, it's okay outside of the workplace, whatever, right? And many, many winters ago on this channel, I covered a story about a female from the UK who attempted an all-female startup. And I've looked for that article again, and you can find the URL, but I've actually scrubbed it from the internet. It doesn't exist anymore per se. You'll get a URL with an empty page. And I think almost certainly because that article and the complaints the woman had made about the women that she had hired in the office, these things have just shown a bad light upon them, and you can't have that in the current day and age, right? But we're talking about catfighting, infighting, the few times an attractive male would enter the office, for example, to fix something, they would all vie for his attention, really, really petty things. And I remember distinctly in the article that she said she would never do that again. She would always have males in the office, indeed a majority of males, because it just ends up being a more cooperative, more functional environment for the purposes of work. So there's that too. Of course, we don't think about these things. And I do think it's context dependent. I think, for example, that a majority, obviously a vast majority, maybe to a T for all I know, in terms of, say, nursery school teachers or kindergarten school teachers, they're going to be female, and they're probably going to get along, or working at a daycare center. There's probably going to be less of that type of backstabbing and pettiness that you might have in an office with the occasional attractive male, striving to vie for attention, etc., because they're focused on a different task that they might arguably be more and better inclined towards. We didn't think about it when we decided this would be a great idea, and now we're dealing with the consequences. But the consequences are really important when it comes to being a man, above all that, because you really need to think about what kind of work you want to do. Sometimes you're already knee-deep in the work and it's too late. But especially if you're a young guy, consider that it might behoove you to not enter into fields or industries that are dominated by females or you get parity. So if you get into electrical engineering or computer programming, you're much less likely to have a lot of female colleagues. And to the extent that you do, they're probably going to be more based than the average female because they're more inclined to do that sort of thing anyway. They're going to have more of a male brain, although not exclusively. Because having been a teacher and then having worked in an industry that has relative parity, it's very, very difficult to get along in that sense. And I don't mean something along the lines of going out of your way, doing things. I mean, I just keep to myself and do my own thing. And even that at times was viewed as hostile or unfriendly or whatever. So this is something that we need to bear in mind going forward as males, but especially as a young guy. Consider the consequences of working in that close-knit environment with females that you're not related to and you're not romantically involved with, and then think about what could result from that. It's a very, very risky situation. Just recently, that guy Pete that everyone invites to gatherings put out a video about the empathy gap, and there were some stories related there about people getting fired in precisely just such an environment. Again, we opened up the floodgates, and we didn't think for 2 seconds what might occur. And now we are dealing with the consequences. And of course, it's on you as an individual man to make these decisions and navigate the flood. And if you can, it's probably better, in my humble opinion, to completely avoid any contact with females in a work environment, if it's possible. I'm not saying it is possible in every situation, but if you can, either work in a specific situation or in a combination of a specific situation or industry or field or sector, where it's very, very improbable that you'll have to work with women, you'll be better off for it. There's no reason in today's day and age why you should force yourself in a potentially risky situation where you're going to end up walking on eggshells regardless of what happens, versus being in a situation where you can just chill out, do your work, and be left in peace. It's apples and oranges night and day. There's just no reason to choose the former over the latter, in my humble opinion. Again, humans just do things and they hope for the best. Unfortunately, that's not exactly an attitude or a methodology that necessarily yields the best results, and I think we are paying the price for it right now. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, share, subscribe, leave comments, all that YouTube jazz. Much appreciated. And if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you. Take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.